This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
County Mayor Mark Luttrell on schools, taxes, and more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. We are joined tonight by Shelby County Mayor Mark Luttrell. Thank you for coming back.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Eric.
it.
Good to be here.
Also, Bill Dree, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. We're in budget season, and there's a lot going on in budget season. Obviously, there's a tax reappraisal that is, caused some say unprecedented change with the tax base, the value of the properties going down, and you've got a school situation that is to some degree unprecedented. There's a gap, or the school system still has a gap of some, we'll call it $30 million, give or take. This is the consolidated school system. You've proposed a tax increase, I believe 6 cents, that would, above the recertified rate, and we'll get into the math a little more here in a second, but what would that tax increase do, and is that a solution that can pass the commission?
Eric, county government has three fundamental responsibilities: public health, public safety, and public education. And those are very core issues. Our schools are going to cost us more money. We knew going into this merging of the two school systems that it was going to cost more money, primarily because $68 billion that was there from the city is no longer there. So you start off with a $68 billion gap just to begin with. You cap that with the fact that for the first time in our lifetime, we've seen an appraisal of property that has gone down. Our property is not worth as much as it was 4 years ago. We have this reappraisal, state mandated reappraisal every 4 years. So we saw a gap there. So I look at it in many ways as the perfect storm. We had our property values go down. We saw the needs in public education, the financial needs of public education increase significantly. And then, in addition to that, the Department of Justice laid some pretty heavy mandates on our juvenile court for constitutional standards for the defense of our youth, criminal defense of our youth. So the combination of those three, after much deliberation and really scrubbing our budget in county government quite thoroughly, we suggested that in addition to the certified tax rate, that we have 6 cents added, which would allow us to give the schools an additional $20 million. They indicate that their gap is $30 million, but we've talked to them, and I think that they can find the additional $10 million. Since we had our initial discussion with them, they received an increased appropriation from the state that was not anticipated, and then they've got some fund balance, some reserve funds that they can add to it. So I think the $30 million gap can be bridged.
And are you satisfied that they have cut enough, that they have trimmed this being the school system, have trimmed their budget enough? I mean, we had Wyatt Bunker, county commissioner, on. We had a number of school board members recently. Bunker particularly was not satisfied that enough cutting had been done, that there were inflated salaries, that there were, on the legacy city school side. Are you satisfied that they've cut as much as they can?
I'm satisfied that they've cut significantly. I do think that there's some areas that they should consider paring back a little bit. The schools need to go through the same exercise that the rest of government goes through. Every year, we've got to look for smarter ways to budget. We've got to look at what technological advances can create some efficiencies for us. The school system must be challenged the same way. Education has to be a top priority. It has to be a top priority in every community. They have done a magnificent job of cutting back significantly to try to cover that $68 million gap resulting from the city's withdrawal of funding. And they have done a good job. Could they do more? Probably so. But I don't want to micromanage the school system. I want to give them an opportunity to really work through the process really for the next 3 years before we have to reset the maintenance of effort. And they've got 3 years to really comb their budget to determine what indeed are the true cost
Right.
of education.
Well, 3 years in which most likely a big portion of the school system is going to break off.
Yeah, I think it will.
And so you've got a whole lot of unknowns.
We're
there
going to
as
have
well.
a reset really next year, assuming
Right.
that municipal districts do come into play. I think we're going to have a reset of the entire scrutiny of the education budget. So what we're experiencing this year, I think we'll experience it next year as well during the budget season.
Bill.
Mayor, you you weren't happy at all with the pace that the school system or the school board in particular had taken early on in this. What happened that made you look at this and say, I feel like they've done enough that I can go ahead and advocate for a 6-cent tax hike, a risky thing to advocate for anyone who holds elected office?
Yeah.
At what point did they convince you, or did Dorsey Hobson convince you, or whoever made this decision? At what point did they convince you to go and try to sell this tax hike?
Bill, I was in a unique position serving on the Transition Planning Committee that for the last year I've had a bird's eye view of the school system and the school budget. I had a pretty good idea of what they could bring their budget to. We pushed long and hard for them to embrace the recommendations, or at least modify the recommendations that were made by the TPC. I found it very frustrating that they moved at such a glacial speed in doing that. But in my mind, and I think in the minds of most of the people that served on the Transition Planning Committee, is we knew what would be a fair figure for them to come in on. We tried to not micromanage, as I say, particularly as it relates to the schools. We did get into the upper management discussions, security and things of that nature. They brought their budget finally into a figure that I felt was reasonable. Now, did they prioritize the way that I would have prioritized? Probably not. But they're the educators, they're the professionals, so I want to defer to them to a certain extent. But from the standpoint of the dollar figure, I'm satisfied with the dollar figure they brought forward. In the years to come, I think that as we get settled into this transition, we know the reality of municipal schools, we ought to be looking at it again. Emphasize that we have 3 years to reset the maintenance of effort. And we need to use those 3 years to really take a very diligent, comprehensive look at the school system and what we want in the future of our school system, and really ask some tough questions as it relates to some of the salaries and some of the decisions.
So do you think that once that maintenance of effort is reset at the end of that 3-year period, do you think that Shelby County funding of the Consolidated Schools District is lower than it is now?
I wouldn't guess in that area right now.
Okay.
I would say that we've just got to see how they maneuver through the possibility of the municipal school districts, what type of restructuring they do at that time, and make a call on an annual basis until we can get through that 3-year period.
And the maintenance of effort, just for folks who don't follow this closely,
Yes.
is goes back to the state.
The maintenance of effort is a state standard that says that once you've established maintenance of effort, you cannot fund the school system for less money unless there's a decrease in enrollment.
Okay.
Now, our maintenance of effort is sitting at about $362 million. So we know that we need to fund them at $362 million unless there's a substantial decrease in enrollment. With this merger, that gives us the opportunity to reset that maintenance of effort.
Right.
So we could over the next 3 years, theoretically, we could go below the $362 million.
A big question, we talk about municipal schools, we talk about all this money, is the school buildings. And that, clearly if the municipalities are going to break off, they want those buildings. They clearly aren't going to want to build new buildings. Not like anyone wants to do that. There are conversations that have started, apparently. What is your take on how those buildings ought to be transferred? What is the fair way in which they could be transferred to the municipal?
My position on that is very simple. Most of our county debt is attributed to school construction.
Right.
And when we consider the future use of those buildings in the municipalities, we need to consider whether or not giving those buildings up to the municipalities is going to adversely impact our county debt. And if it's not going to adversely impact the county debt, I'd say let's either give them the buildings or rent the buildings to them, lease the buildings, come
Right.
up with a very fair settlement of how those buildings are used. But we've got to keep a very close eye on our county debt. Our county debt is high.
It's about $1.4 billion, $1.5 billion.
Right at $1.4 billion. We've been able to reduce it substantially in the last 3 or 4 years, but we still have a high debt, and we're progressively paying that debt down. So we really need to balance off our debt reduction plan with any plan for the disposition of those buildings. But if we can give those buildings to them or rent them or lease them at a very reduced cost and not increase our debt, then I think that's the direction we need to go.
And I heard so many people talk about these buildings and the taxes and the debt. And I'm going to put you on the spot and see if we can do a bit of a math problem here out loud.
Okay.
And we'll just do it really round.
You're really going to challenge me now.
I know. What I hear people in the suburbs say is, look, I pay county taxes, which the rate right now, let's say it's right around $4 and change. Bills call it $4, and I pay my city taxes, and wherever I live, they might be $1, $2, wherever. I pay my county taxes, and as you just said, that tax money, that tax revenue goes towards county debt, most of which are these schools. Why would it change if I live in Bartlett or I live in Germantown? I'm going to continue to pay my county taxes, and that's going to continue to go to pay down that debt. It's semantics. There's no additional cost, and why should I, as a person in Bartlett or Germantown or one of these suburbs, have to pay anything? Because I'm already paying for those buildings.
Yeah. Eric, under the municipal school plan, as established by the state, the municipalities must contribute financially to their school system.
Right.
And that financial commitment can be in any number of different ways. And buildings, I think, would certainly have to be one of those considerations. You've also got to consider that people inside the city of Memphis have paid for some of those schools in the suburbs as well. So that argument can really cut both ways.
Right, absolutely.
So
and
I
you hear
think
that
we need to simplify the process and really say, okay, municipalities and the county and the state and the federal government are all going to contribute to public education. And we have to work out an equitable financial formula to try to be as fair as we can in that process. My concern is, of course, we've got to continue to pay our debt down. If we don't pay our debt down, then we run the risk of really having some serious financial problems down the road when it comes to our bond rating, our ability to borrow money, our ability to continue to be financially viable.
Okay.
Shelby County government is very strong financially as far as our financial picture is concerned, and we can't really afford to jeopardize that.
Bill.
So if a municipality, Bartlett, let's say, meets the minimum contribution that the state requires through the sales tax hike that they did, is there a point at which they could say, we've met the minimum the state requires and we don't have to contribute anymore? Is that what could complicate the buildings?
I don't know that has really been the thought process. The municipalities are going to spend the amount of money that they want to spend to get the quality of education they want in their community. And my guess is you'll probably see the municipalities will be contributing more than their minimum amount. And then it's just a financial arrangement and financial discussion as to how we get the buildings to them. I want to work with the municipalities in every way that we can to make their system work. And at the same time, protect the financial interest of Shelby County. So we'll work with the municipalities, at least to my way of thinking, any way we can so that they have the money that they need to provide a quality education for their students.
On this program 2 weeks ago, Billy Orgel, the chairman of the school board, in a conversation with County Commission Chairman Mike Ritz, basically said, we're not going to give the buildings away. Should the school system expect some kind of return in this transaction?
I think they can. I think they can expect to either rent or lease the buildings. I would hope that they would consider donating the buildings where it's financially able to do it. And I think that there may be some situations where they could do that.
With older buildings?
Yeah, I would hope that all sides would be very open to what's going to work. We have got to really kind of have a paradigm shift in our approach to education and understand that education as we have known it is going to be different from the way it's going to be in the future, and really change our way of thinking as far as how we can, as a community, make this thing work. And to make this thing work, we're going to have to do things a little bit differently. And if a school is needed in one of the communities there, and that building can be given to them, then that needs to be a consideration as well. If we can't afford to give it to them, then let's consider what is a fair value to either rent or lease that building.
We talk a lot about taxes, and you talked about the suburbs, eventually probably doing quite a bit more, and I've heard other people say that than the maintenance of effort. But there's a lot of tax money here, and so right now with the rate before reappraisal, county taxes was 402. With the recertification, it went up to
432.
And then with the 6 cents, we're up to 438.
That's within the city of Memphis,
Right.
and outside the city.
And people, and so we've got, city of Memphis is in the 330 range, and you've got, Germantown, Collierville, the low tax suburbs eking up bit by bit over time, and they're taking on this school challenge, and the funding of the schools going forward, assuming they do break off. Are you worried about the competitiveness of Shelby County as a whole and the areas, the various municipalities within it? I mean, you get to see the whole big picture of Shelby County, suburbs and city. Are you worried that we're going to tax ourselves, that whether out of being competitive in terms of businesses coming in, new families coming in, and so on and so forth?
I'm always worried when we have to raise taxes, and that's why I really struggle anytime that the raising of taxes becomes a discussion. But the reality of it in Shelby County is we're no longer just the big city of Memphis and the rest of Shelby County. We have 7 municipalities, and 3 of them are in the top 25 as far as population. So we've become a very urban county. And as you have urban counties, or counties become more urban, then you start looking at building infrastructure for how you can sustain that growth. We are different from what we've been. Our infrastructure requires additional attention. We're traveling roads outside the city of Memphis that were built in the 1940s. And they're carrying 100 times more traffic than they used to. So those are things that you have to take into account when you're growing the size of your community and people are moving into these suburban communities. We do in some ways have a high tax rate, but in other ways we are one of the more affordable large cities and urban counties to live in America. I was talking to some people today that moved in from Wisconsin, and they said, you talk about high tax rates, but the housing prices here are just wonderful. There is still a comfort level in our community on the quality of life that you can have in this community with the high taxes. I don't particularly like high taxes,
right,
but I do try to balance it off on the livability of our community, and we still have a lot to offer as far as the quality of life.
Let's shift gears to again, funding issue that is been evolving here over the last few months, which is auto inspections. City of Memphis is trying to get out of that business. It's the only, if not, one of the only municipalities that does its own city inspections. I think I'm going to get this right, or auto inspections. They'd like the county to take over, the state, or someone. What is the status of auto inspections right now?
Well, first of all, Memphis has been inspecting autos for 25 years. They have a contract with the state and also with the Environmental Protection Agency to provide emissions testing within the city. That contract runs until June of 2014. So first and foremost, the city has a contractual obligation to continue in that area for at least another year. They have stated that they are pulling out of that. We approached the state, we collectively as a county approached the state and said, what are our options? One of the options that they presented to us was that the state could take it over. So we chose that option. The state has now come back and said that option is no longer on the table. So I think where we're sitting right now is that the city has got to decide how they're going to move forward on this. Some in the city say that it's an equity issue. I think it's more of a financial issue than an equity issue. They have done the inspections for 25 years. Equity has never been a concern until this year. And there's also a contractual obligation. So I'm hoping that the city will meet their contractual obligation some way, somehow. Now, Shelby County government, the health department, has responsibility for overall air quality. The city has the responsibility by contract for emissions testing. We're going to continue as a county to look for ways that we can compensate for and help the city if they withdraw from the emissions testing. The county will not assume responsibility for emissions testing.
And there's a lot at risk in this, right?
There's a lot at risk,
Mayor
but there are
Wharton
also
put it-
some limitations. Shelby County government can't dictate to the other 6 municipalities emissions testing. So if Shelby County was to mandate emissions testing, we could only do it in the unincorporated area of Shelby County.
Should be a
and
strange-
that's not going to solve our air
Right.
quality problem.
And get us in compliance, because
Yeah.
if we're not in compliance with the EPA standards, if I read this correctly, there's a tremendous amount of money that
There are
highway money, all kinds of money that funnels from the federal government, the state.
Possible sanctions.
Yeah,
And,
right. And
if-
limitations on new industry that could come
That's true.
in terms of economic development and relocation of industries and so on.
If the city is not going to emissions test, then we're going to have to start looking, and by we, I think that we can work with them. We've got to start looking for some alternatives to emissions testing, so that we can demonstrate to EPA that we are making progress.
Okay, Bill.
Is there a possibility that the county could say, we will pay the city to continue doing these inspection services for 2 more years until the new EPA standards come?
We just don't have it in our budget, Bill. We just talked about a tax hike of 38 cents. We have asked about as much from our citizens as far as a tax increase for Shelby County that we can do. I emphasize that the city has a contract, and they need to honor the contract that they're under, which expires in 2014. At that time, EPA will then make an equity determination. And it could very well be that EPA will then say, county, you've got to have countywide inspections. Then we'll start moving in that direction. But that determination has not been made. What we know now is that the city has that responsibility at least for another year, and then we will reshuffle the deck, work with EPA, and come up with a new, what's called a SIP, a state inspection program, and we'll move forward from there.
Take me behind the scenes a little bit, if you will, because the contract hasn't come up in the city's description of these talks. I take it that contract with the state, between the state and the city, has been discussed in these talks that you've had, the city and the state?
Yes, it has been. The discussions that we've had with the Commissioner of Environment and Conservation is very much aware of it and referenced it. Right now, it's a city responsibility as long as the current contract remains in place, and that will be for another year. Now, that said, Shelby County government has a responsibility for overall air quality. So we're going to be working with the city in every way that we can to help meet that standard over the next year. Mayor Wharton and I have been in discussions already about what we can do alternatively, and we'll continue those discussions. We'll present a proposal to EPA. The sanctions that have been referenced are worst case scenario sanctions. If we can demonstrate that we're making progress toward attainment, then that should help us get through the next year or two when the contract will be renegotiated.
And that's an 18-month clock, well, not clock, but calendar.
That's
actually,
correct,
that you're
18
talking
months.
about.
Now, if EPA doesn't see any initiative demonstrated at the local level to address this discontinuation of emissions testing, then the sanctions could be more immediate. And we don't want that. I know the city doesn't want that, so we've got to see what we can do to help the city resolve this issue.
Speaking of resolving an issue, go back to something you mentioned early on, juvenile court. You have a long history, sheriff and law enforcement, corrections, running jail, the Shelby County Jail, and so on. Do you think that the sanctions, or the settlement and the requirements put in place by the government on juvenile court are fair? They're costly. You talked about that, and the need to part of the perfect storm you described, but are they fair and necessary?
I think they're fair, and I have worked with the Department of Justice before when I was the sheriff. We had a similar situation some 12, 15 years ago that we had to work through. And the Department of Justice is very, very focused on constitutional standards, and the whole juvenile justice system is undergoing some rather radical changes nationwide. We happen to be on the cutting edge of that, And I think much of what we do here will become the standard for juvenile justice systems across the United States. But they have come in as a result really of some complaints that were filed back in 2007 by the by several county commissioners. I'm not going to say the county commission because not all of them signed on to it, but several of the county commissioners raised the issue. They raised complaints. Those complaints have been folded into the discussion. Many of them have been confirmed by the Department of Justice, and they have worked out a remedial plan that I think can work. If we don't fund it and we end up having a lawsuit with the Department of Justice, it will be very, very costly for this county, and it's something that we can avoid if we get behind the plan and meet the standards, the constitutional standards that they've mandated.
Just 1 minute left. Bill, you last question.
Should the state take on the funding and coordination of the public defender aspect of these reforms?
I don't think that they'll take it on completely. They have an obligation to help us fund it, but according to their funding structure, they're not mandated to assume that full responsibility. We're carved out from the rest of the state. Nashville, Davidson County, and Shelby County, Memphis are carved out from the rest of the state. We're under a different system of funding. Part of it's local, part of it's state. And they have been very generous, and they've continued to work with us. They will continue to work with us.
All right, we will leave it there. Thank you, Mayor Luttrell, for
Thank you,
being
Eric.
here. Thank you, Bill Dries, and thank you for joining us.
Bill, thank you.
Join us again next week. Good night.